And it was into that really fertile time in the biological and medical sciences that my hero, John Beard, was born in 1858 outside of Manchester here in England. He studied invertebrate zoology at the University of London, here in London, and really was on the road to carving out a very esoteric niche in the academic research world. I mean, he was interested in the development of the sense organs of worms, specifically parasitic worms that lived off another worm. And he really carved this niche out as his own area of expertise, and no one else was particularly interested in the morphogenesis of the sense organs of parasitic worms that lived off of other worms. So he had a really good career ahead of him if he stayed straight and narrow. But then a series of events occurred that would change his life and ultimately my life forever. He got a fellowship to study at Black Lake, which is a lake in the Adirondacks of New York State. He decided he would do something really, really radical. He was a guy trained as an invertebrate zoologist that's studying the sense organs of worms. He was going to look at fish, which for him was a major departure. And specifically, he decided when he arrived at Black Lake in the Adirondack Mountains that he was going to study the billfish. Well, the billfish in the Adirondacks are kind of a sport fish. They're related to the marlins and swordfishes of saltwater fame. The billfishes actually were Ernest Hemingway's favorite fish during his Cuban days, but they make a good sport fish up in the lakes as well. They grow up to about 2 feet long. And he was going to study the morphogenesis of the nervous system of the billfish. And he was a meticulous scientist, and what he did that summer in the Black Lakes, I mean, he was a very focused kind of guy. When you read his papers and read his life, this is a guy that cared about nothing but science. He could have cared less that he was in this beautiful wilderness. Didn't mean anything. He was going to study the development of the nervous system of the billfish. Of course, fish reproduce by releasing sperm and eggs into the water, and then the sperm fertilizes the egg, and then the embryo starts developing. And Beard took hundreds and hundreds of specimens of these eggs, starting day 1 after fertilization, day 2 after fertilization, day 3 after fertilization. He was looking to see how that embryo would develop and how its nervous system developed. But prior to Beard, scientists had already recognized that before the embryo actually appears, there's a little tissue that forms in the fish egg called the blastoderm. Nobody knew what it did. It wasn't associated with the embryo. It appeared before the embryo. It was geographically separated from the embryo. It would flourish for a time, to use Beard's terminology, and then would gradually regress as the embryo appeared. It was thought to be some vestigial tissue. You know, when scientists, biologists can't figure out what something does, it must be vestigial, because someone as smart as a scientist, if it did anything valuable, the scientist would already know. So they just assumed it can't possibly have any value. It was just this vestigial tissue that appeared before the embryo, geographically separated from the embryo, was not part of the embryo, and seemed to have nothing to do with the embryo, and then it would regress as the embryo developed. And it was called the blastoderm. Well, Beard, in his own esoteric, arcane, focused way, decided he was not going to study the development of the embryo itself, which would seem somewhat important. He was going to study this vestigial blastoderm. Why I decided to do that after years of studying his papers, I could never figure out, but thank the Lord that he did. So he started studying this blastoderm, and he noticed how it would develop and develop and develop, and then suddenly the embryo would appear separate. This is all happening within the egg, but it would develop separate from the blastoderm. As the embryo developed, the blastoderm would regress. Well, his fellowship came to the end, and he really hadn't done too much with this blastoderm. He put his slides away, put them in boxes, went back to Freiburg, where he was still associated with the Anatomical Institute. And winter came, and he didn't have a whole lot to do, so he decided to pull out these slides and start studying them. And he had thousands and thousands and thousands of slides. And thank God for these scientists that are focused on the most arcane things. And Linus Pauling once said something to me. He said, we tend to criticize scientists because they focus on some esoteric, arcane piece of nature that seems to have no relevancy to anything important. But it's like William Blake, from a grain of sand, you can find universal laws. You can see the universe in a grain of sand. Beard would ultimately prove that thesis to be correct. So Beard's hypothesis that cancer doesn't develop from mature differentiated tissues, which caused enormous scorn. He was ridiculed. Beard wasn't a cancer researcher by training, though he knew more cancer histology than any cancer histologist I've ever read about. He didn't come out of a medical institution. He worked at the University in Edinburgh in their zoology department. He had no reputation as a medical researcher, let alone as a cancer researcher. And yet he'd outsmarted everybody. 100 years ago, Dr. Beard discovered stem cells. For that alone, he deserved 5 Nobel Prizes. 100 years ago, he proposed, 100 years before Wicca and Dirksen and Bonnet at the University of Toronto, that cancer doesn't develop from mature differentiated tissues ever, but only develops from those primitive, undifferentiated germ/stem cells. He called them germ cells. We now call them stem cells. Well, Beard's initial successes in the literature, and believe me, they were very impressive, both laboratory as well as clinical work, did interest a lot of physicians. And lo and behold, pharmaceutical companies around the world, from the U.S. to Italy, began, without consulting Beard, without talking to Beard, began producing their own pancreatic enzymes for use for the treatment of cancer. Well, physicians all over the world, without talking to Beard, without learning how to use it, without studying the doses and which forms, and Beard only said there were two forms that he recommended, Merck and Fairchild. Fairchild, an English company, made the best enzymes at the time. They didn't know, and other companies jumped on the bandwagon. Cure for cancer, pancreatic enzymes, even though Madame Curie already had the ear of the press. Beard's work, he'd been nominated for the Nobel Prize. It still had a lot of interest. But a lot of unscrupulous companies made lousy products, and the end result is people died, and there were negative reports that began to seep into the literature. In 1909, a Scandinavian researcher by the name of Hull tested 8 different pancreatic enzymes commercially available, including the Fairchild and the Merck formulations. And lo and behold, they would vary in potency from bottle to bottle of the same brand, from brand to brand. None of the bottles had what was claimed on the label. A lot of them were absolutely useless. The variations in potency were up to 400 times, published in the British Medical Journal. Beard himself, in his own book, had a chapter bemoaning the dearth of active pancreatic enzyme preparations, and warned physicians if they didn't consult with him and use the right form, right dose, right formulation, they were headed for trouble. Well, a lot of physicians didn't listen. Madame Curie had the ear of the press. There were negative reports appearing in the literature. Through no fault of the theory, it was a fault of the careless application of the therapy without consulting Beard. By the time Beard died in 1924, he died in total, absolute obscurity. He never achieved full professorship. He never was again nominated for the Nobel Prize. Tragically, so much of his embryology work, the germ cells, all of that's in the current embryological literature. He made discovery after discovery in terms of the genesis of the nervous system, both in vertebrates and invertebrates. He's quoted throughout the embryological literature, and the embryologists don't know anything about his cancer work. The people in cancer know nothing about his cancer work at all, or his embryology work. But he never achieved the fame that he should have. And it's just through serendipity and through the grace of God and other acts of nature that his work didn't die forever.